prison pipeline is a phenomenon that is really a reflection of gross inequities in educational opportunity that flows especially along the lines of race, but also class, disability status. We're also learning the impact on LGBTQ students. And what it really shows is that when schools fail to adequately provide educational opportunities for all kids, and we're talking about public schools, so we take kids as they come, and when we fail to meet their needs, what happens is it's much more likely that they fail academically, that they drop out of school, and that they wind up on the streets unsupervised. And a big part of this is school policies and practices around discipline, but it is really much more than just the discipline policies and practices. We happen to have, in some cases, very clear data on what's happening with kids around discipline, but that's really the tip of the iceberg. It really starts, some people would say it's a cradle to prison pipeline because the inequities start in the larger community. But because as a matter of advocacy, we know there's a great deal more that schools can and should be doing to provide equitable opportunities for all kids, but especially kids of color and kids with disabilities. Moreover, that schools have the power and the means to stop certain policies that are exacerbating these other inequalities in the area of discipline. So, for example, harsh zero-tolerance policies, we've seen a dramatic rise in the use of suspensions, out-of-school suspensions and expulsions in response to even minor misbehaviors, typical adolescent behaviors. So in a certain piece of the school to prison pipeline really reflects educationally unsound practices that are layered on top of these other very serious inequalities in terms of inequitable school resources. For example, who is more likely to have unqualified or inexperienced or teachers teaching out of field, like the gym teacher teaching algebra? It is poor and minority kids across this country who are more likely to have, schools that have inadequate facilities, poor heating, poor air conditioning. Who is more likely to populate the school hallways with police officers rather than provide adequate adult supervision? It's the same kinds of places over and over. So the school to prison pipeline is affecting not only the students, but also the families in schools. So in terms of families, what happens when kids are repeatedly suspended, for example, for minor offenses, is that it just adds stress to families that may already have many stressors. So whether it's a single-parent home or a home where there's poverty or any multiplicity of those factors, there could be abuse going on in the home. So even the idea of an out-of-school suspension, some people say, well, the parents are the problem. The research really doesn't suggest that we should be blaming the parents, but to the extent that there are dysfunctional parents, probably it makes no sense to push a kid out of school and expect a dysfunctional home to right the situation. So, and that in fact does happen in many circumstances. So it adds stress to families. It can propel parents and families that are trying to struggle to keep their heads above water with regard to poverty. It can actually cause parents to lose their jobs, because if they have to decide between going to work or supervising their child who has been suspended from school, they may have to choose work, or if they choose to supervise their child, they may lose their job. Either way, they're setting up their child for additional failure. And the way it affects schools is that we know that from research, for example, a recent study from University of Chicago Steinberg and Allensworth, looked at all the schools in Chicago and found that the sense of safety was highest even in schools serving children from the lowest income and the highest crime neighborhoods, when there was an investment in trust and relationship with parents and teacher-student relationships. And those schools felt as safe as schools serving kids from the wealthiest districts where they didn't make those sorts of investments. In other words, there's a lot that schools can do, and the reverse is true. So schools that add cops, add metal detectors, and neglect investments in developing and strengthening the relationships between parents and teachers and teachers and their students, those schools tend to fall apart. They have lower achievement. They're kicking kids out of school right and left, but it's not working as a deterrent. It's not addressing the misbehavior. So those schools often are experienced as chaotic, uncaring, cold, and places where kids just don't want to be. So those schools, when they adopt really harsh policies, are really exacerbating whatever negative issues are already going on outside the school. They're just adding to it. School discipline policies, harsh ones, are often layered on top of inequitable distribution of resources. We also see that there's a tendency to hire the sort of militaristic principals, leaders who have this sort of get tough on kids approach. You don't see them in the wealthy suburban schools. You see them in poor minority schools serving, high concentrations of poor and minority students. And I think this is a reflection of those schools don't have enough resources to really do what's necessary to provide the social and emotional supports for kids, to provide the training. And so there is this sense, it's almost like cannibalism, that we can't really teach all the kids. We don't have the resources. So we're going to kick out the, quote, bad kids so the good kids can learn. And that, in fact, you can find even more profound statements along those lines from guys like Joe Clark, who was made famous in the movie about East Patterson High School, I believe it was. I think it was Lean on Me. And really what we're doing is we shortchange the students. We don't provide enough quality educators, special ed supports and services, trained counselors, and instead we populate these schools with leaders who are really looking to push out kids that they don't have the support and funds to adequately educate. And it's the same kind of situation when they add more police to these schools and more metal detectors. Really, this is acting as a filter device. They're pushing out kids who may exhibit challenging behavior, kids who would, in most cases, be very successful in other educational settings where the adequate resources were provided. So at the heart of a lot of what we're talking about with the school-prison pipeline is lack of adequate resources to meet student needs. First, with regard to students with disabilities, it's important to note there's a federal law called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, originally passed in 1975 as, I think it was the Educate All Handicapped Children Act. The point of the reason that legislation, what we now refer to as IDEA, was passed, it was inspired by the fact that in Pennsylvania and Washington, D.C., there were lawsuits against districts there because they were denying access to education, wholesale denial of access to schools for kids with disabilities. And the rationale that was proffered by the districts was these kids are just too difficult. They'll pose behavioral problems. They'll disrupt the educational environment. So the idea of excluding a whole group of kids with disabilities, on behavioral grounds, was challenged as an equal protection issue. And it was about to go up to the Supreme Court, and everyone anticipated that they would rule in favor of the plaintiffs. And Congress acted by passing the IDEA, which provides a range of protections and also provides additional money, resources to provide for the education of students with disabilities. So there's this long history of pushing out or keeping out kids with disabilities based on mostly unfounded concerns about behavior, but also ignorance about what schools can successfully provide kids with disabilities, including those with behavioral issues. There's a great deal that schools can and have since proven very effective in terms of providing the resources and the supports for these kids to be successful and be mainstreamed in our community rather than shunned and pushed to the basement or out of school altogether. And similarly, kids who are especially Latino and especially African American kids have traditionally had to fight this uphill battle in terms of equitable access to education. So we had Jim Crow, but after Jim Crow, we had this confluence of disability and discrimination on disability and race, where to avoid desegregating schools, some districts would identify large segments of especially black students as having mental retardation, emotional disturbance, and using this as a justification to separate them out of the mainstream setting and educate them in isolated, segregated classrooms within the school. And so on top of this, and during the same period, we also saw that black students were suspended out of school, expelled at much higher frequency than white students. And when you think about it, especially in the South, as schools were being forced to desegregate, it's the same principals and teachers who, white teachers who, and leaders who were trying to block access of black children to these schools, now were in charge of their well-being. And so it's not surprising that they perceived the black kids as misbehaving more and found all sorts of excuses to push them out and keep them out of school. So that's the legacy. Today, most educators would not acknowledge any kind of intentional discrimination, but we haven't escaped the implicit bias that is all around us, including myself as a civil rights advocate, including even black educators, where this legacy of discrimination against especially black, but also Latino and others, and there's also implicit bias against kids with disabilities, the idea that we don't want to educate them or we have lower expectations either academically or behaviorally, all these notions that we may not ever articulate or acknowledge or agree with, they still populate the atmosphere and inform our perceptions whether we like it or not. And most people sort of even resist that concept, but the data are pretty overwhelmingly showing that this concept of implicit bias really does affect perceptions and also treatment of African American students, and it especially shows up in discipline and in disciplinary exclusion. So we see at the middle school level, for example, in many districts, over half the black kids enrolled have been suspended out of school at least once. And then if you look at black kids with disabilities, we're seeing even higher numbers. Across Memphis, Tennessee, 80% of black students with disabilities suspended out of school at least once. So the exclusion of kids from school on the basis of race and disability with this sort of background implicit bias is certainly informing this. It's not the only thing. There are other issues as well. For one I mentioned earlier, the greater likelihood that if you're black or a kid with disabilities, you're going to have an inexperienced teacher. Well, I know I taught for 10 years. In my first year teaching, I was sending kids to the principal's office right and left because I didn't have adequate training and skills in classroom management. I did develop them because I was in a pretty wealthy district where they provided that training, and I got the resources and the support I needed to be a much more successful teacher. But also inadequate instruction in reading or math. It frustrates bright young folks, so that anyone would start to misbehave if you're exposed day in and day out to inadequate instruction. So that's another, and we know that poor and minority kids are much more likely to have ineffective teachers. So those are just some of the ways in which these things, there's sort of a structural racism as well as implicit bias that informs what we understand of the data, which show profound differences in terms of who is suspended out of school or expelled from school.